Hello, I'm Leisha Francis, and I'm reporting for the NB Media Co-op from Elsipogtog First Nations, New Brunswick. The Canadian government recently invited people to share their feedback about changes to a policy that I had never heard of before. It is called the Additions to Reserve Policy, and under this policy, parcels of land can be added to an existing First Nations reserve. The Government of Canada has asked people to share their thoughts about the policy through an online survey. You can also submit written feedback by email or contact the Department of Crown Indigenous Relations to set up a virtual meeting with government officials. The review period is open until September 22nd, according to a news release issued by the government last month. To learn more about the Additions to Reserve policy and the changes that are underway, I contacted Russ Diabo. He is a policy analyst and a member of the Mohawk Nation at Kahnawake. Diabo has been active in Indigenous politics since he was a teenager. In 1972, he traveled to Washington, D.C. to join the occupation of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The following year, he was at Wounded Knee during the standoff on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. He is well known as a policy analyst and as the editor and publisher of the First Nations Strategic Bulletin. I wanted to get his thoughts on this policy to ensure that members of the community can provide an informed opinion if they decide to provide their feedback to the federal government. I started by asking, what is the Additions to Reserve policy?
It's a policy that's been in place by the federal government for decades now, but now there's been a lot of complaints that the purpose of the policy is to add parcels of land to a reserve for socio-economic purposes. And for a long time, that was their policy, but they didn't do anything with it, really. They didn't add reserves. And I think it was 2016 or so that they amended the policy to start addressing the requests for pieces of land to be added to reserves. And then there was complaints about the backlog, that it was taking years because of the procedures being so slow, the bureaucratic procedures within the department. And they had like hundreds of requests that were backed up. So this policy redesign that they're doing is trying to address the backlog and to streamline the process so that when a band buys a parcel of land, a piece of land, it can be added to the reserve and get reserve status. So that's what the policy is about. The redesign, they're trying to speed it up. Now, the thing you got to know is that there's 3 land registries. Okay, there's the Indian reserves under the Indian Act. Most of the bands in Canada their reserve lands are still in the Indian Reserve Land Registry. But with the Framework Agreement on First Nations Land Management Act, they created another land registry, for a First Nations Land Code registry. And then the third one is for self-government. When bands go into self-government arrangements, that's a third land registry. So there's 3 different land registries. Now, the addition to reserve is to add lands to the reserves. It doesn't affect land code bands because they're not under the Indian Act. They're under the First Nations Land Management Act, a different federal law. So what they're doing is when they buy a piece of land, they're getting it added to their land code lands. Same with the self-government. If there's under self-government, there's self-government First Nations who still have reserve lands, and there's self-government First Nations who only have treaty lands, in a modern treaty. So the policy only affects Indian Act reserves, bands with reserves, and it affects self-government groups who have reserved land still. Because in many cases, when you go into a modern treaty, you're giving up your reserve and getting your land back as fee simple. So you're in that self-government land registry. So there's 3 land registries. They're maintained in Ottawa. They register all individual interests, on the lands, like on reserve land. If you get a certificate of possession on the reserve, that says you have the rights to a piece of land on reserve where you can build your house and all of that. Some bands don't have certificates of possession. My band, Ganawagi, has like 70% of the land is under a certificate of possessions, or CPs, they call them.
Okay.
Um, so so these 3 land registries are databases that are computer databases that are kept in Ottawa and managed by the bureaucracy. So they update them. They control that. But right now, the government's negotiating with the Lands Advisory Board um, to basically offload their management of these land registries to a nonprofit corporation that they're going to create, which is going to be run by land code bands and self-governing First Nations. So this addition to reserve policy is tied to these larger pieces. And
Mm-hmm.
and so when I say there's 3 land registries, Indian reserves, land codes, and self-government, the government wants to phase out reserves. So that's why they're encouraging bands to go into land codes. Because when you go into a land code, the First Nations Land Management Act, you're opting out of 40 sections of the Indian Act that deal with lands. So you're basically releasing the Crown of their fiduciary obligations to manage the lands because you're taking them over as a band.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So they're no longer responsible for them. So as a band, and a lot of bands are going into this because they're saying it gets rid of the red tape and allows them to make decisions on land management for economic development without having to go to Ottawa for approval. So that's why a lot of them are going into this. But I don't think a lot of them understand the government calls a land code sectoral self-government. And it's a step towards comprehensive self-government where you do a constitution, you have jurisdiction, local jurisdiction over a bunch of subject areas like education, health, land management's part of it, child welfare, all that stuff. That's where they want all the bands to go. They're moving everybody in. They want them to go into self-government. So a land code is like a transitional step from the Indian Act reserve system into a land code to prepare bands for self-government.
Okay.
So this
And
consultation that they're doing on adding lands to reserve is dealing with the process, the procedures. But it's not, I read the policy, and it's not really explaining what I just explained, which is that, there's 3 land registries, there's the land code, there's the reserves, the land codes, and the self-government registries. And the policy doesn't tell you that the overall intent of the government is to get rid of reserves because they're getting rid of the Indian Act. That's the other thing is under this Bill C-15, the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act that passed in 2021. One of the pieces of that act said that within 2 years, they had to develop a national action plan to implement the UNDRIP Act. And there's a First Nations chapter in that national action plan. And there's what's called an action plan measure in that chapter, where they say that the Indian Act is incompatible with the principles of UNDRIP and has to be repealed. So basically, the plan is to get rid of the Indian Act. And they're getting rid of reserves already through the land codes and through self-government. And then Indian status is being discussed now under the second generation cutoff issue. So that's all connected to this too. You see what I mean? So
mm-hmm.
you're just going to focus on additions to reserve. You have to keep in mind that it's part of a larger national federal plan, and there's different pieces to it. So reserve lands is only one piece.
The reason why, to me, this became an issue is recently the Canadian government has issued a nationwide survey asking about the ATR redesigned add-ons, if you will.
The
But my
policy,
worry
yeah.
is that most citizens do not know this policy even exists. So that asking for feedback to uninformed citizens could cause a problem. What do you think?
I think the government is really only consulting with the band councils and band office staff. I don't think they really are too concerned about what band members think. Um, they'll take their responses, they'll record them, as part of their survey or their engagement, as they call it. But really, I think they're only consulting the bigger chiefs organizations, the chiefs, and the band office staff, the people who are doing land management in the band offices. That's the target audience I think that the federal government's looking at, because that's who their clients are, really. That's who they're dealing with. And
Yes.
and from the people, they're not really they aren't I don't believe they're serious about consulting First Nation peoples, grassroots.
I do have to agree slightly with you there because I think our last conversation you said 20% has to agree. 20.
Well, for a land code, yeah, the way it works is if you want to opt out of the Indian Act into the First Nations Land Management Act, all you need is a band council resolution. And
Mm-hmm.
that starts the process of then applying for funds. And I don't know the exact amount, but it's over 100,000 for a band council to develop a land code. They can use that money to develop a land code, which then has to be presented to the community. So the community doesn't even get a say on any of this until the land code is presented in a community vote, a referendum.
Mm-hmm.
They don't see what's going on inside the band office with, the money to develop the land code. It's only when the land code is presented to the community for a vote, which is required under the law, by the way, the Land Management Act. And the government has set the standard for approval to 20%. That comes from the federal government, the threshold for voting. And so the majority of that 20% gets to decide for everybody. It can be higher, but the reason why they set it at 20% is often they hold these votes and not enough community members come out, for the vote. And so
Mm-hmm.
they've lowered the threshold in the hopes of getting an approval, with 20% or less. So the majority of the 20% decide yes or no. If they accept it, then the land code's accepted.
Mm-hmm.
And then they move to implementing, the code, which involves zoning and all of that, right? And
Mm-hmm.
register all these non-native interests like long-term leases and things like that. But also the CPs and the things that are on reserve now, all the individual interests on the reserve.
Mm-hmm.
Some reserves could have surrendered lands from before that they were managing because they wanted non-native businesses to operate. They had to surrender the reserve land. But in 1988, there was what was called the Kamloops Amendment to the Indian Act. So then they called them designated lands instead of surrendered lands. So in other words, a band could take a part of the reserve and designate it, let's say, for building a casino.
Mm-hmm.
And there'd be a long-term lease with whoever owns the casino, maybe a joint ownership with the band, and that land would be locked into place for the 99 years or whatever the lease is for that business, like a casino. I'm using casino
Mm-hmm.
as an example, but it could be any business.
Mm-hmm.
So some bands have designated lands already. So when you do a land code, you got to include all of that in your land management plan under the land code. All these different interests, on reserve. Well, it's not really reserve anymore because it's land code, land base.
Another aspect to do with the redesign is they're promising clearer partnerships, improving cooperation between First Nations and local towns and provinces. Can you explain how they could do that?
Well, part of it is if you buy a parcel of land and you want to add it to the reserve, there could be issues about services making sure there's like fire protection services and environmental services, other services the municipality may offer. Like, so there should be kind of an agreement. And that's part of the procedures, right? The federal government, when they're looking at turning this land over to become part of the reserve, they have to make sure it's covered by municipal services too. And sometimes, the town that's next to the reserve, sometimes there's agreements for fire protection and things like that, municipal services, because the band may not have them themselves, right? Band they might not have a fire station. So they enter into an agreement with the town next to the reserve for those kind of services. But when you're making the reserve bigger, you have to make sure the land that's being added, that there's going to be covered under those services. That's part of the procedures that the federal government has to look at before it agrees to turn that into reserve, because they have a fiduciary obligation to look after reserves, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they have to do that's all in this new redesign policy. It's all the procedures they have to go through. And they have to do an environmental assessment too of the land that you want to add to the reserve. They have to make sure that there's nothing toxic on there or that before they turn it into a reserve, or if they have to remediate it, to fix the environmental problem before it becomes a reserve. That's all in
Mm-hmm.
this new redesign policy and these procedures. Because most of this policy is about procedures on how you get a piece of land that you bought and turn it into reserve. Because they have the final say. Yes, okay, it can be part of your reserve or not. But there's this criteria you have to meet first before they accept it as being reserve, to be added to the reserve land base.
You said you read the policy. Um, what words or lingos should anyone be wary about when doing such a survey for the government?
Well, when I read the policy, it's very uh, how do you say? It's very bureaucratic. It's like I say, it's mostly procedural. So it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't give you the larger picture or the context of what land codes are about or what their plans are for reserves. Doesn't say that in the policy. The stuff that I
Mm-hmm.
explained, right? I
Mm-hmm.
know that because I'm seeing how that policy fits into the bigger plan that the federal government has with the UN declaration, with self-government. These are where they want all the bands to go, right? They're managing band and the new fiscal relationship, the 10-year grants. That's all about, preparing the bands for self-government. They want the
Mm-hmm.
bands to have the financial and administrative capacity to do multi-year planning, which you need if you're going to become a self-governing First Nation, basically like a municipality, because
Mm-hmm.
that's the status that under self-government you have. A First Nation has the same legal status as a municipality or a corporation. So that's where they want First Nations to go, is into that, to get out of the Indian Act so they get rid of it. That's why they want to transfer programs. Eventually, the Department of Indigenous Services Canada is going to dissolve because they won't need it anymore, because Crown Indigenous Relations will be managing the new intergovernmental relationship between self-governing First Nations and the federal government and provincial governments. Indigenous Services Canada won't exist in the future. And that's in
Mm-hmm.
their own documentation. If you look at the 2018 departmental plan for Indigenous Services Canada, you'll see in that plan it says that their objective is to dissolve as a department. It's in their words, not mine. But it's in
Mm-hmm.
the 2018 departmental plan for Indigenous Services Canada. You can find it online. Jane Philpott was the first minister of ISC, as they call it, Indigenous Services Canada. So she's the one that put that out there in the departmental plan, that their plan is to get rid of ISC because they're getting rid of the Indian Act, and that's their plan.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And a lot of
So, in
community
your
people don't know.
words,
A lot of
no, go
community people
ahead.
don't know this. They're not aware that the government's plan is to get rid of the Indian Act and Indian reserves and Indian status.
I guess my last question is in your words, overall, is the additions to reserve policy good or bad for us?
That's the thing that I can't really answer for a band. Each band has to decide for themselves. What I tell bands is, if you go into a land code, you have to know that this is part of a larger plan of self-government. Um, it's sectoral self-government, which means that you have management over the reserve lands or former reserve lands. Because if you're in the land code, you're not under the Indian Act anymore. You're under a new federal law, the First Nations Land Management Act. So, like I said, a lot of bands are going into that because they want to have a say over managing the reserve lands for economic purposes. Mostly I hear them talking economic, not so much social, but for economic
Mm-hmm.
development purposes. They don't want to have to run to Ottawa to approve, their band council resolution decisions on how to manage the reserve. But when you take it over, you're releasing the federal government from having the fiduciary obligations to manage the lands, because under Indian reserves, they have a fiduciary obligation, um,
Mm-hmm.
to manage the lands for the use and benefit of the bands, of the members. But once you opt into a land code, your legal status and relationship changes. You're moving more towards them you're releasing the government from its obligations because you're taking it over to manage for yourself. But in doing that without being prepared, um, my big complaint about self-government is they've separated land claims from self-government. And so our unresolved issues about impacts of the Indian Act on us, or unresolved issues about stolen lands, like, Aboriginal title,
Mm-hmm.
or violations of treaties, they've got that in separate negotiations. It's not like a comprehensive, well, in modern treaties, it's comprehensive. They're including self-government and, um, you know, giving some land, expanding the land base as part of the deal, and some cash. But it's not compensation for past violations of rights. So I
Mm-hmm.
have a lot of problems with other policies that they're using on us that this is connected to. And I just don't feel it's fair to ask us, to negotiate self-government to become a municipality, basically in legal status. And we still have to then deal with the off reserve issues, right? Our rights
Mm-hmm.
to lands, territories, and resources, like in New Brunswick, right? Right.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think there's an Aboriginal title claim in New Brunswick that's underway, and there's some
Yes, there is.
treaty issues for the Micmac. So there's these unresolved issues, and they're dealing with them at other tables. So I don't think it's a fair process. Plus, I don't think it's fair that the government is trying to say they're implementing the UN Declaration when actually they've replaced it with their interpretation of it in Canada, this Bill C-15, because the UN Declaration represents international minimum standards for our survival. That's what the declaration is about, that the United Nations passed. Um, and if you look at Article 26, well, Article 3 says we have the right to self-determination. To me, that's the most important article because we have a
Mm-hmm.
right to determine our own, political and economic status, or legal, political, and economic status. Article 26 says we have the right to have our lands, territories, and resources restored that we didn't give free informed consent to take. Article 27 says there should be a jointly developed, open, and transparent process to adjudicate the land rights that we have. And the land claims policies were all developed by Canada. We never had any say from them. They go back to 1973, those land claims policies. There's comprehensive land claims and specific claims. It was Jean Chrétien and Pierre Trudeau that created those in 1973. They've modified them, but basically those are the still same policies they're using now. And they're saying they're implementing UNDRIP with that. And then Article 28 says if you're not going to restore the lands that was taken, there should be restitution, either given comparable lands of equal size and value or monetary compensation. So Canada's saying, oh, well, our land claims policies are implementing those sections of UNDRIP. And I think that's an unfair interpretation. It's a one-sided interpretation that benefits the government, not us. They're cheating us because we didn't agree to that interpretation. Well, the chiefs organizations have, but our grassroots people haven't. So this is why I have a lot of problems with the way the government's developing its policy. And they're saying they're co-developing policy because they're doing this kind of engagement process, right? With AFN and, the Assembly of First Nations and Union of New Brunswick Indians, the band councils. That's how they're doing it. But most of the people don't know about this. The UNDRIP Act was passed in 2021 when a pandemic was on. Our people couldn't even hold meetings because of public health issues. So our people couldn't even be part of the discussion about passing that law or the development of the action plan that they're using on us now, which is leading to them saying, okay, we're going to repeal the Indian Act. So it's only people like me that are policy people that follow all this, that watch what's going on, that's saying, hey, this is not right. But it's hard, when your own chiefs organizations aren't saying anything like that. They're going along with it because they're getting funded to cooperate.
Well, that's about all the questions I have today, unless there's anything else you would like to add, Russ.
I think I said it all.
That was very informative, yes. I've been speaking to policy analyst Russ Diabo. Thanks for joining the NB Media Co-op today.
Thank you.
This interview was conducted by Alicia Francis. Wauquist Augustine assisted with camera work. Lance Francis assisted with production. Editing and production by yours truly, David Gordon-Koch. It was recorded in Elsipogtog on July 31st, 2026 as part of media production workshops hosted by the NB Media Co-op. Check out nbmediacoop.org for more grassroots community media. This project has been made possible in part by the Local Journalism Initiative. We also acknowledge the support of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation with funding provided by the Government of Canada. Last but not least, thanks to St. Thomas University's Outage program for providing access to the classroom at the Elsipogtog Community Service Centre.